Great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to another NoBeC talk. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. And thank you so much again for being here. Today, as in previous talks, we are going to follow a very similar agenda than always. First, I will give my short welcome, as always. Then we will have our NoBeC early career researcher for today, which is Manu Munoz from NYU Abu Dhabi. And then we will have our main talk by Matt Lasmanis from Sage Therapeutics. And then we will have some space for questions and answers. As always, I would like to remind you that this speaker series is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are a research center that seeks to enable organizations around the world to sustainably enact positive behavioral change. We do mainly consulting, research, and training. You can see here some of the logos of our parts and partners, and you can see more information about us in the link or follow us on Twitter in the QR code, scanning the QR code. This is our fall programming, as you probably already know. Today we will hear from Matt, of course. And then we have 3 more talks. We still need to reschedule the launch of our working paper series, and that will probably happen in December. So we will confirm the date for that soon. And you can follow this QR code to get more information, to see the videos of our previous talks, to get registered in our shared Google Calendar to get all the updates and so on. A few ground rules, as always. If this is the first time you're joining, please keep yourself muted. If you want, please keep your camera on so that we have a more interactive experience. If you want as well, please change your username to reflect your affiliation. It's always nice to see where people are joining from. For questions, we don't have a co-author today as in previous occasions, so please use the chat during the talk, and Enrique Fatas, our moderator, will be choosing some questions, and we will have time at the end, of course, using the raise hand function. You can do that. As always, we are also transmitting live on Facebook this talk. And the recordings of all the talks are available in our website. The recording of this talk will be available next week. Having said that, let me introduce the early career researcher for this week. Manu Munoz is a postdoctoral fellow at the New York University, Abu Dhabi. The presentation is called The Cost of Social Division, and if you scan the QR code or go to that link, you can access the paper. I see that Manu is here today in the audience, so feel free to send any comments or questions or anything in the chat, and he will be able to respond. So let me share the video. Okay, so I will play the video. Please let me know if there are any issues with sound or something.
To present my paper, The Cost of Social.
Sorry.
Hi everyone, my name is Manu Munoz. I'm a postdoc at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I'm very happy to present my paper, The Cost of Social Division. In this paper, I focus on settings where a minority group is socially excluded by the dominant majority because the group identities the minority adhere to prescribe them to behave in a way that is not aligned with the views of the majority. Minority members can solve this problem by changing their identity and adopting that of the dominant majority. A shared identity would align incentives across groups and promote intergroup contact, which could result in an improvement in welfare for everyone involved. However, identity change may not work when there are barriers to impede it, such as social sanctions that are put in place by the minority group to prevent its members from leaving, or limited visibility so that people who adopt a new identity have difficulties signaling that to the outgroup, which could trap them in settings of pluralistic ignorance. When barriers to identity change are present, minority groups may end up socially divided. That is, a fraction of the minority may improve by adopting the group identity of the dominant group, while a remaining fraction may persist in opposing the dominant identity despite being beneficial for them to not do so. In this paper, the research questions I'm interested in addressing are the following. First, how likely are minority groups to solve this coordination problem with the majority without ending up in a socially divided minority? Second, which barriers, social sanctions, limited visibility, are more conducive of social division within the minority? And third, what cost does social division impose on individuals and groups? To address these questions, I use as a framework a social coordination game in groups of 7 people. 4 are assigned to the majority and 3 to the minority. Every individual in the game is displayed on the screen with 2 symbols, an external symbol that shows the group they have been assigned to, and an internal symbol that shows the group identity they have chosen. In stage 1, individuals decide whether to keep the group identity that they have been assigned to by their group or to change it. If a minority player changes his group identity, he will be a triangle on the outside and a circle on the inside. Otherwise, he will be a triangle both on the outside and the inside. Then, all the choices are displayed on the screen, and individuals decide with whom they want to form a connection. A connection is formed if it's proposed bilaterally by the 2 players involved. Once the network emerges, players decide between 2 actions. A mainstream action M, that is the behavior prescribed by the group identity of the majority, and the oppositional action X, that is the behavior prescribed by the group identity of the minority. Then, the results of the game are displayed, as well as the number of points a person earns. I studied this problem in different settings. In the baseline condition, there are no costs associated with changing one's identity, and the choice is visible to everyone. In the ignorance treatment, visibility is not possible, so that no matter what identity I choose, everyone can see only my external symbol, the group I belong, but not the chosen identity. In the social sanctions treatment, visibility is possible, but the cost of changing one's identity is positive and increasing when more people in my group persist on the original identity, so that deviating on my own is more expensive than changing my identity when others in my group do as well. The results of the experiment showed that minority players strategically changed their group identity to match that of the majority, 95% of the time in the baseline, and significantly decreases in ignorance and sanctions, but is still way above 50%. Despite the high levels of identity change, minority groups not always manage to solve the coordination problem as a collective unit. 50% of the time there is social division in the sanctions treatment, reduced to 25% and 12% in ignorance and baselines, respectively. Now I look at the effect of social division on intergroup contact. When a minority player changes his identity for that of the majority, he proposes links to almost the entire majority, both when he is part of a minority group that is socially divided, as shown by the black triangles, or when he's part of a minority group that is not, as shown by the yellow triangles. The majority reciprocates quite well when there is no social division. However, when there is social division, reciprocity significantly drops, hurting the chances to integrate of those who actually change their group identity in the minority. At the end of the experiment, I give 10 points to every participant to distribute between 1 minority receiver and 1 majority receiver. I find that the in-group bias within the minority is higher the more socially divided the group is, so that in sanctions, the in-group bias towards the minority receiver is about 50% and decreases in ignorance and the baseline treatment. In this paper, I've studied a problem of social coordination between a minority and a majority group. Minority players can facilitate integration by strategically changing their identity and matching that of the majority. However, this is only effective if they do it as a collective unit instead of being socially divided. When there are costs to identity change, social division is more likely to arise, which prevents integration even of those who actually change their group identity, and also biases distributive preferences towards the in-group, negatively affecting the out-group. As such, effective policies could work on reducing the cost of abandoning an inefficient group norm and not only on highlighting the benefits of integration. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Manu, for this great presentation. So unfortunately, we don't have time to do live questions for Manu, but as mentioned, please write any questions or anything in the chat, and you can connect there. And now, yeah, and as mentioned, you can scan this QR code or follow this link to access the paper. Great. Let me now introduce our main speaker for today. So Matt Lasmanis is the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at Sage Therapeutics. The talk is called Driving Digital Transformation. And Matt is an award-winning digital and biotechnology executive. At Sage, he leads the company's overall digital vision, strategy, and transformation. And he heads Sage enterprise-wide innovation, data analytics, and technology capabilities. He was previously at GlaxoSmithKline, where he served as vice president and CIO. And he also worked he led the digital platforms team at HarperCollins Publishers. He is an active thought leader and speaker and regularly shares his perspective on digital transformation and strategic leadership with global and local audiences, a topic we will hear about today. And he is a member of the advisory board of our center as well. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us on NoBeC Talks. Oh, and of course, the moderator for today will be Professor Enrique Fatas, who is a practice professor in the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences here at Penn and a core member of our center. So yeah, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us, and I give you the floor.
Great. Thanks, Pauly. It's a real treat to be here with everybody today. I'm going to share a presentation. It just has a couple slides in it, but let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, we see.
Great. So as Pauly has mentioned, my name is Matt Lasmanis. I'm the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer over at Sage Therapeutics. I've been at Sage about a year. Prior to Sage, I was at GlaxoSmithKline Pharmaceuticals for what amounted to be about 20 years or so. So I started in 2001. I thought I'd be there for a few years, and I kept finding amazing, interesting things to do. So I was in research and development for about 10 years, and on the commercial side of the business for about 9, all in digital data, technology-oriented roles. As Pauly has mentioned before, life sciences, I was in a completely different industry. I was actually in the publishing industry, running digital platforms at a major publishing company. In my line of work, what I'm really trying to do is help firms understand how to digitize their businesses. And that really came from my early experiences at HarperCollins Publishers, where I was technically part of their corporate strategy function. And I think the light bulb came on for me back then that digitization, the use of technology, the use of innovation, it wasn't going to be something that was on the side or on the periphery of firms and institutions. It really was something that firms should be thinking about weaving into the DNA of how they thought about their corporate strategy and their corporate perspectives, and that firms that sort of took that approach were going to kind of improve their chances of success moving forward. So ever since then, my career has been about digitizing businesses. I really focus on roles in areas that I have a passion for, like life sciences and healthcare. And I try to match that with my strategic approach to innovation, data analytics, and technology. What we're going to talk about today for a few minutes here are some of the lessons I've learned along the way, trying to drive change across very large organizations. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the kind of leadership thoughts and challenges that I've faced over time. So one of the one of the first things I talk to teams about, I talk to organizations about, is this concept of chasing shiny objects. And what I mean by that is, in my line of work, it's very easy for teams to get enamored with new technology, new shiny digital objects, and not necessarily think about the problems that they're trying to solve strategically. Now, why is that? If any of you have done any research into technology innovation, you know that technical innovation typically happens on an S curve, where at the beginning of the introduction of technology, you have a lot of what's called a hype cycle. That hype cycle meets reality inevitably in almost every technology. And then you sort of have a gradual slope of practical adoption. That's just inherent, and it's very prevalent in the line of work that I sort of do. So one of the first behaviors and changes I'm trying to bring to organizations is all around what I call strategic problem solving. So setting technology on the side, setting innovation on the side, and really thinking about what are the strategic problems at hand, what are the strategic problems that we're trying to solve, and then think about the solutions we're trying to match up to those problems. Those solutions could be skills oriented, they could be technical, they could be data or analytics driven. But the main thing I try to coach teams through is to really focus on the problem, the hypothesis that we're testing, the sort of jobs to be done, and then get to sort of technology strategy, technology conceptualization. And I think if there's one behavior, one change I'm trying to drive with teams when I take on new roles, this is probably the one that really rises to the top. And so the lesson here is don't necessarily chase shiny objects, try to figure out what problem you're trying to solve, and then figure out what the solutions to that problem are. So hopefully that's relatively straightforward. The other aspect that I encounter a lot as a sort of digital strategist, technology leader, is this area of transformative change. And I think in my experience anyway, and there's actually a great quote by Hemingway around this, change tends to happen gradually then suddenly, right? And if you think about some examples of this in history, you could even look at the current pandemic that we have experienced and are experiencing from the perspective of you had an immense tragic societal impact of that experience of society. Underneath that drove acceleration of a lot of technical innovation and change that had already been there, but was accelerated, right? And in the healthcare and life sciences industry, that innovation, I would say, was accelerated by 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x in some cases when you think about collaborative work, new types of teamwork, new types of collaborative cultures that healthcare and life sciences businesses were trying to introduce as a result of the tragedy, the simultaneous tragedy of the pandemic that we all experienced, right? And so this area of understanding your environment, understanding the transformative change that's around you, and really thinking through what are the pivot points of technological innovation is so core to what I do as a technologist. If you look historically at some of the things that really have been pivot points throughout the history of technological innovation, I like to kind of anchor back to the Gutenberg press, which was one of the first inventions by society that made the replication and dissemination of information very fast and very cheap. That kind of led to the evolution of the microprocessor that created the advent of computer networks and the internet. And that really set the stage for cloud technology. And as we sit here today with the massive amount of mobile devices, cloud services around the world, the Earth on any given day creates a massive amount of information and a massive amount of data. That's about 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. And to give you an idea of how much information that is, if you were to attempt to print all that data out, which you can't do, there's actually not enough trees on the planet to do that, and you wouldn't want to do that. But if you could somehow take that printing press and attempt to print that data out, one day of data, the resulting stack would reach nearly from Earth to Mars every single day. So now think about the evolution of that, right? And in all that data, every single day of every year are the future solutions to the problems that we're trying to solve as a society. And we have to think through, how do we approach that? How do we use that information to solve problems and fix issues that we're seeing in the various industries and sectors of society? So the main lesson here is when you're working through change, particularly technological change, you really need to understand the environmental context, how that's sort of shaping what's happening, but also the new types of opportunities that become present as a result of those environmental shifts. And at the end of the day, they typically happen gradually, and then there's some pivot point, some external vector that creates a sudden shift in that. So that's transformative change. This is an interesting one. So once you sort of have an idea of the problem set you're trying to solve, the environmental context that you're in, you really have to be very honest with yourself about where are you currently today. And I think it was Steve Jobs that said, you can really only connect the dots about the future looking backwards, right? And kind of what he meant by that was that to really think about the future orientation of what you're doing, you have to put yourself and envision a world that you can't directly see, right? But you can look backwards from that thought process and figure out the path to getting to that place, right? And there's a lot of examples of this. If you look at Microsoft putting a computer on every desk, if you think about Kennedy and his vision of putting a person on the moon, what you're really trying to do here is conceptualize a future state that you might not be able to linearly see, but you can put yourself in that mindset and think backwards in terms of how you might sort of be able to get there. And in my line of work, what we try to do here is we try to baseline the maturity curves of where firms are from a digital maturity perspective, because that gives us a sense of what's possible, what are the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities for a particular organization. We think about the future of where we're trying to go, and we work backwards from that baseline to figure out what are the things we might need to change, what are the things we might need to reorient to put us on a trajectory to kind of getting to that place, if that makes sense. So the basic lesson here is you might not be able to see the future in a linear fashion. You have to kind of envision a future that you might not be able to see from a linear point of view. But if you envision that future and you look backwards and connect the dots, that might create a potential path for you to achieving that. So that's kind of where you are now. And this one is by far my favorite sort of part of the lesson and the process that I tend to go through. It's about strategic choice. And I think, it's famously been said that culture eats strategy for lunch, but at the end of the day, you have to eat lunch at some point, right? And you have to think about what are the choices, the strategic choices that I'm trying to make. And I think it was Hewlett-Packard that sort of said that most firms die of indigestion, right? They die by taking on too much scope. And in my line of work, that is a very real issue that we have to deal with, because in digital and software, we're not building physical constructs like physical buildings or facilities necessarily. We're building soft assets, and the potential for scope creep, the potential for tools to get beyond their original sort of intent and purpose and investment is actually really high, because theoretically speaking, there are no limits to those kinds of assets. And so this idea of strategic choice, figuring out what your core value proposition is, figuring out the core of what you're intending to do, and figuring out what you're not trying to do is just as critical. So I do a lot of work with firms thinking about strategic choice and strategy, thinking about core value proposition of digital tools, and then thinking about how do you actually prioritize your investment portfolios to make the best use of the resources that you have, again, to get yourself down that trajectory of the path towards that future that you're kind of envisioning, if that makes sense. So that's strategic choice. And then for the digital side of things, the idea of ecosystems is exceptionally important. And so this really gets to, once you've sort of figured out the work to be done, well, how do you get there, right? And inevitably, aspects of that future are already here, they're just poorly assembled, right? So you have to be thinking about what are the types of partnerships you need to introduce in order to achieve the goals and achieve the outcomes that you're looking for. And inherently in the digital space, there's a lot of these kinds of assets and tools and services that may already exist. And what I find in my experience working with companies is that this area of getting good at partnerships, creating partner ecosystems, building fluid organizations, building adaptable organizations that aren't necessarily the traditional hierarchical concept, those are the kinds of approaches to organizational models that are really allowing firms to accelerate in the future because they're making the best use of the capabilities that exist versus always thinking that you need to build these things from scratch. And it's interesting to take a publishing example. Some of this stuff is kind of counterintuitive. And so back 20 years ago when I was working in publishing, we were trying to think about how we could create a business model around ebooks, as an example, right? And that made so much strategic sense, and there were so many partner ecosystems that we could construct to do this. But in that particular example, there were other factors that also needed to be true to allow those things to accelerate. So some aspect of it was timing. So back then you couldn't give ebooks away. Obviously today, many of you probably have them. And of course they outstrip traditional book sales. So part of this is partner ecosystems. And then from a temporal perspective, how are you applying those ecosystems at the right kind of pivot points from an overall technological point of view? And so for me, we do a lot of work with partnerships. We do a lot of kind of ecosystem API development work, those kinds of things. And I think it'll be interesting to see how organizations approach this space sort of moving forward. So that's kind of partner ecosystems. And then from a cultural point of view, I think, a lot of the work that we do has a very heavy technical and technological aspect to it, but it really is all about the people that work on these projects, work on these tools, work in our organizations. And when you're trying to formulate the right culture to achieve these kinds of outcomes, you have to think a lot about the behavioral aspects of culture development, which I'm sure is part of a lot of the research that the team on the call here does. And there's a few things that we tend to stress from a technological or digital organizational culture. And I think they're exemplified by three sorts of sports analogies, if you'll kind of forgive me in advance. So the first one is don't chase the ball, right? And if any of you have been part of, it's called soccer in the US, it's called football appropriately, and basically the rest of the entire world. If you've ever seen little kids play soccer or football, what do? They are constantly crowding the ball. And what occurs? Those plays tend to get absolutely nowhere on the pitch, right? But as teams progress, they start to understand what are the formations I can create? How can I develop the right role structures? And if you look at a professional football team, you'll see they're very spread out. the plays cross the entirety of the field, and that concept of exclusively crowding and chasing the ball those players have forgotten that decades and decades ago. So that, in terms of that analogy for us, it's making sure that we use the entirety of the team, that the team knows their roles, and they also understand how to be as effective as they possibly can in the roles that sort of exist. The other analogy, and I actually wrote an article about this, you guys can go look up. I'm an avid skier. I've skied since I was about 5 years old. And the other analogy I use is around kind of the enabling of teams to be fluid and adaptable, and the role of leadership in that kind of context. And I think the observation I had one day, I forget where I was that it's kind of interesting when you're skiing. One of the first things that you learn is to keep your shoulders downhill and not stare at your skis, right? Which at first makes absolutely no intuitive sense, because why shouldn't you look where you're going, right? But in reality, if you keep your head tilted a bit up and you're looking further down the hill, that enables you to adapt to moguls, adapt to turns, adapt to change. And that can be a counterintuitive discipline to kind of build into your teams. But the idea is you keep focused down the hill, you enable your skis to deal with the bumps, the jagged pieces, the ice, and as a coherent organization, you move towards that end objective without exclusively staring at the short-term issues from a leadership perspective, right? So that's one metaphor I like to use around enabling teams to adapt to change. And then the last one was mentioned to me by a friend of mine a couple of years ago. There's a rugby team, I believe they're out of New Zealand. They're one of the most winning teams in the history of all of sports. And they have a lot of different mantras, but one of them that has stuck with me the entire time is this idea of leaving the jersey in a better place. And when my friend was telling me about that, basically the concept was, when you get onto that rugby team, you're handed that jersey, and your mission, your goal as a leader is to leave that number and leave that jersey in a better place than you found it, right? And one thing I'm always talking to my teams about is, how can we add value? How can we think about succession planning for our key leadership? But fundamentally, are we leaving what we're trying to do, whether for our customers, for our internal organization, for the capabilities that we're trying to develop? Are we leaving those things? Are we leaving them in a better place than we found them? And I thought that analogy from rugby was really awesome. So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do from a leadership perspective throughout my career, I take roles, I focus on roles that are in sectors that I'm really passionate about. My career really started from the idea of merging strategy with digital and technology. What I've learned over time, that technology is really great, but it's really about the problems you're trying to solve. And what's way more important than the problems are the teams, the people, the leadership that you're trying to develop. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to the cultures, the behaviors, the values that you're trying to build and kind of instill into organizations. And so that's kind of the main sort of set of lessons I've learned over the years. And Paulius, I don't know if we have any questions or want to have a bit of a discussion on a couple of those things. So.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was great. Yeah, so Enrique will help us moderate the questions. We don't have any yet in the chat, but yeah.
I'm sure we are going to get questions from the audience. I see many students around who will be delighted to get a little bit more about your experience at Sage. But let me start with a general question in this direction. This is I mean, you just said it, that you accept the roles where you can feel the passion, and I would like make a question about the connection in your job with behavioral sciences. So yes, I mean, you are in charge of digital innovation, data analytics, technology. But could you please give us one maybe example of how you integrate in your team? I mean, ideas coming from one specific idea coming from behavioral sciences, just to exploit the benefits of its lessons.
I mean, the application of the conceptual ideas of behavioral science, mindset change, culture change, they're almost woven into the thought process of in my opinion anyway, the vast majority of the things that we think about as sort of leaders. I think one of the areas that I've really focused on in the past is, for lack of a better term, this idea of culture. And in terms of the application of these kinds of tools, the ability to listen to organizations, establish a baseline, a quantitative and qualitative baseline of what your team and what your organization is telling you, and then be able to utilize that to improve the operation, improve the motivation, improve the efficiency of teams. I've seen a huge amount of beneficial outcome from that. And it's difficult to do to a degree, but in some application, it's a relatively simplistic utilization of behavioral science sort of tool sets, but it can be extremely powerful, especially when you have organizations that are very large scale, organizations you can't immediately get your head around or talk to everybody in the team like that. The utilization of those kinds of tools I found very, very effective sort of in the past. And that's just one small discrete example from a behavioral sciences space, but has, I think, a direct application into how organizations think, how they listen to their employees, and how they seek to implement really positive change in the cultures that they're trying to introduce. So.
Certainly, it's great to hear from you that you are interested in this organizational side of behavioral sciences. I mean, how to improve, how to change the culture of organizations is really a fascinating topic. So I believe it is time now to get any question from the audience. I mean, you just need to raise your hand, and then I will give you the chance of making a question. Okay, trying to get. So I don't see anyone. Federico?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt, for your presentation. Well, I have a question. Do you think the points you have highlighted are also valid for the public sector? The topic, for example, of the ecosystem partner seems to me particularly important, especially from a public-private partnership perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think, in my experience, creating partnership ecosystems is something that's exclusively a private sector piece. I think, to your point, public-private partnerships, public organizations themselves, I think in some ways that idea of the ecosystem, it's inclusive of almost all the different kinds of institutions and organizations you could possibly think of in some ways. And I think just like private firms, public institutions are trying to innovate and are trying to create change. Many of them are also trying to introduce digital experiences, digital strategy, digital transformation as well, and are even utilizing some of the same types of products that private firms are. So I think to me, this area of evolving, the ecosystem of firms towards digitization is not something that's exclusively a private sector issue. And I think you've seen that in nonprofit organizations, you've seen that in the public sector as well. And I think, to me personally, I think you'll continue to see the evolution of that as some of the changes in society around digital collaboration, digital working, new ways of working become kind of normative, and those technologies and experiences also evolve. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, great question.
I have a follow-up comment on that. I believe the pandemic has dramatically changed the way we interact in organizations. I mean, digital transformation, I believe the pandemic was an opportunity to establish a new communication channels, new rules of how to interact with other organization members. So maybe it could be, if you could share any thoughts
Sure.
about your prospects, about whether or not some changes are here to stay, and whether the digital office structure needs to be revamped after the pandemic or not, and maybe any thoughts on that direction?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned a little bit of this in the piece around environmental context and environmental change. I think in the life sciences industry, you did see an acceleration of the use of digital tools, specifically with the pandemic as a pivot point, just out of necessity. The reality was a lot of the use of digital collaboration, digital analytics, those kinds of things were happening anyway. They were just at a slower trajectory. And that was kind of my point around, how do things change? Well, gradually and then suddenly. And in this case, of course, we had the tragedy of a societal pandemic. I think the necessity that was created was the acceleration of the adoption of some of these tools. And I think I saw a quote, I forget who it was in the healthcare industry, but they basically theorized that the healthcare sector went through 15 years of change in 5 months. That was their conclusion after looking at it. And I think, this team knows better than I do, but if you think about the length of time now that we are utilizing these kinds of tools, we are establishing habits. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he has a whole new structure of his workday, right? Based on, his new ways of working as a result of a lot of use of collaborative technologies, videos, similar to what we're doing today. I think there are aspects of that you will see become normative. I think there are other aspects when the safety conditions are correct and all those sorts of things. I think you will see in-person collaboration used for the things where that has the greatest impact, when the appropriate conditions are met. So I think you'll see those two things blend. But I think, from my perspective, some of the benefits and the norms that we've seen through the use of virtual collaboration, I think some of those are here to stay, actually, from a normalization point of view. And to give you a simple little example, I'm actually in Boston right now. So usually, right, I would have been down at Penn. We would have done aspects of this face to face, and we've become used to this kind of working, and it's enabled us to all around the world, sit here today and have this great dialogue. So I think some of this will be sticky. Some of the previous forms of collaboration will come back in new ways when it's safe to do so.
Certainly. I mean, you are not the only one who is not physically in Philly. If you think about, the attendants, they are all over the place.
Yeah.
So thank you. Yeah. Any other question from the audience? Okay, if we don't have more questions, maybe, I'm sure Matt will be happy to reply to you if you contact him. And probably what we are going to do is to leave it here. Matt, thank you very much for this really interesting and fascinating presentation. And I would also like to thank publicly Manu for the presentation he made at the beginning of today's session. And let me just, before I pass the ball to Paulius, to remind you that we have more speakers coming, that there are still 3 more speakers coming before Christmas, and we also need to reschedule the launching of the working paper series. Did I miss anything, Paulius?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, thank you so much to all the participants and to Matt and Manu as well. Yeah, and as Enrique mentioned, in 2 weeks on November 18th, we will have Professor Jan Chen from the University of Michigan. So see you all here, and thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to come and chat with you today.
Thank you
so much.